We are live.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christina Joy. Welcome to Sankofa Video Books and Cafe. We are here tonight for a book release. Give it up for the book release. It's Pub Day, y'all. Tonight we have two amazing authors in the house. The author of the hour is Leslie Penelope, the author of Daughters of the Merciful Deep. Look, check it out. Look, Daughters of the Merciful Deep. That was, y'all cute. And Dolan Perkins Velez will be engaging her in conversation about this amazing book. It's historical fantasy, y'all. That sounds so cool. Like, it's history and fantasy at the same time. I love that. I love that. So, only a Howard alumni. Ain't you? Thank you. All right, y'all. Let's give it up for Leslie.
Come on.
I didn't know you went to Howard. Is this on? No. Oh, now. Here we go. I didn't know you went to Howard.
Yes, I'm licensed.
Well, I am so excited to talk to you today, Leslie. Happy Pub Day. So, y'all, I know Leslie from her other life. She is also, she says in her bio, she's both right and left brained, and she really is. She's like brilliant in a lot of different ways. And so I was really impressed. I didn't know that you had, is this your 9th book?
It's hard to count. Something like that. Yes. It's my 6th traditionally published book, and then probably more than that for indie published books.
Okay. That's a lot of books.
It's a lot of books in 9 years.
And your books are thick.
Yeah.
So you had some novellas.
I had some novellas.
But this is like...
Yeah, that's a good 100,000 words. I don't do much that's less than that.
But it's good. I didn't want it to end. Like, I wouldn't have cut a single page. Okay. So let's just talk about, why don't we start with how you began to think you wanted to write about these Black drowned towns?
So the idea first came to me, it was summer 2021, and there was a viral video clip from the Amber Buffin Show, which was a late night show on the Peacock Network, and it was about drowned towns. So I heard about drowned towns, but it wasn't really in my consciousness. I just kind of brought it up, kept seeing that clip over and over again online. And I was on vacation in Vermont, in Burlington, Vermont, and we were driving over Lake Champlain. There's this very low bridge, and this was in the fall of that year. And I was just thinking, I looked over into the water and was like, what if there was a town under there? And I just had the idea of drowned towns. I knew that there wasn't any towns, I don't think, under Lake Champlain, but just the idea of it, and then the idea of Black Atlantis. And the quote, the ending quote from the first Black Panther movie, where Killmonger is, like burying me in the water, in the ocean, where my ancestors went to. I always know the quote, but they would rather die than be enslaved. And the idea that there's this notion of Umoja, who is, an Orisha of the waters, saving enslaved Africans who were, tossed overboard off of the slave ships. And all of those things sort of coalesced into this idea of water, drowned towns. How do we save people who were drowned, who lived underwater? How did the gods and goddesses come into play? And after, a few months of just researching all different things, the story just started to take shape.
Tell me about that research. I'm real curious. I know I've heard you mention Lake Rainier in Georgia, which I only know because Usher's stepson died in that lake.
Oh, really?
Yes, did you know that?
I didn't know
Y'all
that.
Remember that when his stepson was run over by a jet ski? It was a horrible accident. And my understanding is a lot of people think that lake is cursed.
Yes.
Because it buried a Black town. But
Right.
does that play into your research?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the most famous, Lake Lanier is one of the most haunted lakes in the country. Haunted. People think it's haunted. Over 500 people have died there since the lake was created. It was created by the construction of a dam, and it's just far more deadly than any other lake by orders of magnitude. Many more people die there. There are stories of the lady of the lake. There was some women in the 50s who kind of crashed, and people hear voices. But it's a big tourist destination outside of Atlanta. And so underneath Lake Lanier is Oscarville, Georgia. And Oscarville was the site in 1912 so about 40 years before the dam and the lake were created. In 1912, there was one of those situations where there was a young white woman who was assaulted and killed, and they sort of went and found the nearest black men to charge with this murder. And they arrested a bunch of people, there were lynchings, and then there was a trial, and it was just a horrible situation. And then after that, after these two teenage boys were convicted in a one-day trial and then executed with a crowd of hundreds watching, night riders went through and basically expelled all of the black people in Oscarville. And people were landowners, they were business owners, many of them lost everything, or they sold for just a fraction of what their land was worth. And there were no, I think in Forsyth County, which is the county that Oscar was in, it had less than 1% black people or something like that after this happened. And then a few decades later, the lake is constructed, and then the dam is constructed, and the lake is formed. So there's a horrible history of that lake, and it just goes into, and then before that, even before that, I think it was the Choctaw Indians were part of the Trail of Tears, and they were forced off their land before that. So there's just this long history of terrorism and people being forced out. And then you have this tourist destination, you have this lake. And so there's that disconnect there, and there's that history, and people are wondering, is that why so many people die? Is it just that legacy is carried forth in the energy of that land, basically?
Was Awenasa inspired by that particular lake and town, or was this completely imagined?
So Awenasa is the fictional town in the book, and it was a combination of several places. So I did research on Oscarville, and I did research on a lot of other thriving black towns to figure out what would a black town be, because that history was repeated in terms of racial expulsions all over the South and in other places, the Midwest, the North. It wasn't just the South, but you hear about it a lot in the South. And so there's other instances of, so A, you've got like the racial expulsions, and then B, you've got the drowned towns. And there were a lot of the towns that were put underwater were not all black, but generally didn't have a strong voice. They didn't have, it wasn't like a town of rich people who were going to be drowned. These are people who are marginalized in different ways. And there are a lot of black towns that are underwater. And so I was thinking, a black town is usually a place where people find refuge and safety. And then to have that taken away again, after they've gone, whatever they came from before, they find this place of refuge and safety, and then it's taken away from them again. So Awenasa is based a lot on Cowalija, Alabama, and this other place called Beulah Land, Alabama, which were both had similar histories in different parts of the state they were found by formerly enslaved men after the Civil War who worked, saved money, bought land, bought lots of land, and started mortgaging it back to other black people, and created schools, created businesses, created entire towns full of black businesses, and they were thriving places. And then both of those places were eventually put underwater or partially underwater by dams and by lakes. And so there were these instances of black people, and these were both in the late 1800s all the way up to the 1930s, because a lot of dam construction was during the New Deal. And these places that were thriving, that were community, and they were not just community, they were giving back. They had built schools, they were educating people in different ways, and they were. There was one where there was a black railroad. This town was so prosperous that they needed to get their goods to market in a faster way, a cheaper way. So they built a railroad, and they were shipping to Europe. And this is before World War I. That World War kind of made caused those businesses to go down before the construction of the dam. But still, there were just these examples of thriving black communities, and that's what I wanted to show in the fictional town of Awenasa. And then you have the dam, and you have all this other history that goes along with that. But in and of itself, they were doing really well, and they were supporting each other, and it's a thriving community.
And you really capture here how a black community feels, right? Like everybody knows everybody. I mean, even in that very first chapter, we get so many names of just people who all know each other. And if a stranger walks through, everybody knows that person is a stranger, I love that, and how Jane feels. Tell me about Jane. So your main character, and I know this is Pub Day, a lot of people haven't read the book, so we're not gonna get too deep, no spoilers. But Jane, your main character, doesn't speak ever since, I'm gonna say a traumatic event. But she can whisper. but it hurts to speak. So she's writing and she's also signing. How difficult was that to write, and why write her as a young woman who doesn't speak?
Yeah, so the character of Jane was very loosely inspired by a young woman from Oscarville whose name was Jane Daniel, who was caught up in that situation. She was actually arrested as part of, and her brother and her cousin were the ones who were put to death, and her husband actually was killed also. And so there was a situation with, this young woman who had gone through that, and I wasn't basing it on her. Like in The Monsters We Found, my previous book, I based the main character on a real person. Like this was her fictionalized. My Jane is just inspired by this character. But thinking about having gone through something like that, having gone through she went through a traumatic experience when she was a child, and experiences selective mutism. And so she doesn't speak. And I researched selective mutism to see, can they whisper, can people whisper? And what I came up with is yes, you can, but it's difficult. You're not going to hold conversations in a whisper. And even though it's not a physical ailment, it's the trauma response, it still causes you to just not be able to speak and whisper.
What did you call it?
Selective mutism.
Selective mutism. What is that?
And this is a specific kind of selective mutism, but it's often as a trauma response. So you just lose the ability to speak. You cannot do it. Your vocal cords are intact. There's nothing physically wrong, but you can't speak. And I wanted her to be a person who was dealing with guilt and grief, and those things literally stopped her from being able to use her voice. And so the sign language came in as a way to have her be able to communicate. I studied sign language for a while. At one point I was trying to become a sign language interpreter. And looking back through history, there were schools for deaf and mute Black people, obviously separate schools, this is still Jim Crow, but sign language was still thriving, and this point people were being taught sign language. So in a community that's supportive and where she's part of the community, I envisioned a place where if someone couldn't speak or if someone was deaf, then the community would gather together and learn some sign language. So everyone in this town knows a few signs. Some people know many more signs. Some people are completely fluent in sign language. And then she can communicate by writing for those who can read. And so selective mutism is really interesting just because people deal with trauma in different ways. And the metaphor of finding your voice, that becomes important in the story. But it's also just how do you deal with grief and guilt and eventually hopefully self-forgiveness and healing. And that's a part of the journey that Jane takes as well.
Oh, that's so interesting. I write like historical fiction realism, and I feel like that's so much work. You are doing all the work that I do, plus you are building a fantasy world. Can you talk to us a little bit about the world building of this book and how you came about thinking about the ancestral spirits and the gods, and how does your brain work? I'm just curious.
Well, it's very chaotic, first of all.
I think you're very organized, actually. I think this is the whole right brain, left brain thing. Okay,
It's an organized chaos. So I was originally thinking, looking into actual Atlantis, what if Atlantis was actually African, and just researching the different stories of Atlantis. And then talking to my editor and my publisher, I was like, oh, well, and this was before Black Panther 2 had come out. So it was, and the marketing started coming out, maybe not Atlantis, because that's kind of being done. And also just try to do something new and unique. And so back into the research, and I wanted it to be grounded in diaspora. And so I've always been interested in the Orishas and the idea of them and the way that they were dispersed. So you have, Africans taken from West Africa, brought to the Americas, with their religion, with their beliefs, and then but separated, and then they're mixed with people from other nations and other backgrounds, in addition to Native Americans and Europeans and religion. And you see the Orishas coming about and manifesting in different ways in the Americas, in Cuba and Jamaica and all over South America. Just they have different names and they have different embodiments, and sometimes they have different abilities. Sometimes they're male and female, and sometimes they switch, and sometimes they're married, and sometimes they're brothers and sisters. And the stories are, you can see the roots, but they're different everywhere they go. And because when someone is taken from their culture and they're brought to someplace new, new languages, Creoles come about, and maybe you can understand certain words, or you can see the origins of certain things if you look through to the roots. And so what is my version of that? What is this place, this invented place? And how does that play out in this world? And so I wanted to do something with the Orishas, and I wanted to do something with some of the ideas of, there's a Haitian idea of this island under the sea where you go after you die. And I read different accounts of it, and so that's kind of where it started. It's taking pieces of things and saying, well, this is just another version. This is the way that voodoo and Santeria and candomblé and other things that have their roots in West Africa are all different, but there are things that overlap and things that you can see that have the same roots. This is another version of that. And so we have this place called New Ile, which is the fantasy world, where they go sort of through a portal through the river, and you discover, that it is one of these places, and that the Orishas exist here, and they are believed here. And there is some of the same mythology is there. I give them slightly different names because, if you're familiar, like Umoja has many different names. I wanted them to feel like it's another part of this history. It's slightly different but still reflective. And then the world building sort of comes out of that. The magic system comes out of other mythology, other legends, just ideas that I had. I wanted to do a different kind of magic system than I've done before, but also grounding it in the themes of the book and the idea of memory and forgetting. Awenasa is a place that I made these postcards for the city of Awenasa because their tagline is never backwards, ever forwards. So I had the idea that memory is very important. They don't look back. This is a town where looking back is just painful. You want to go forward. And so they've taken that, and it's almost not weaponized, but they've taken it to an extreme where they can't remember certain things, and Jane can't remember certain things, and that memory is holding her back, and the lack of memory is holding her back. Not facing your past can hold you back. So I guess my creative process is like pulling from a bunch of different places. I read a lot of things, and it just goes into the blender in my head, and it gets spit out in a specific way for this specific story.
There's so much you just said. And you talk fast too, you don't come fast. Okay. And no, don't beat yourself. There's so much. Okay, so one thing I wanted to respond to, which I just love, was this idea that they can't remember anymore. And that for so long, for Black folks, we, put that stuff away in a little box, generationally. But it eventually comes out in a very, very painful way. And so we must remember, right?
Yes.
Even if we've forgotten. And to me, that's sort of like what you're doing here is you're excavating those towns so that we will remember. So I love that. And I did, notice that in the book, but hearing you say it, I think that's such a profound thing. And that's what I say, there's so much I wanted to say to that, make me forget my train of thought. But tell me, like, the magic system, which is so fascinating to me. It's so hard to build a magic system that is consistent, that works. I mean, I know when, I'm workshopping like student fantasy or speculative fiction, a lot of times there's all kinds of gaps and holes in the magic system. Tell me how you create a magic system, particularly one that is based within actual African beliefs and in a sort of Afrocentric perspective. How do you do that? Do you have like a spreadsheet, a notebook, like graph paper? Like I'm just curious, like nuts and bolts, how you do that.
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of spreadsheets involved in my process. I have this massive, 10-tab spreadsheet.
I told you were organized. Use spreadsheets. Okay, come on.
I do use spreadsheets. So for the magic system, I have like a template. It asks questions like, how is it internal or external? Is it gestures or speech or materials or some combination of those things? What are the costs of it? What's the range of it? So I have a list of questions that I ask myself. But for this magic system, it's called Omo. And it was based in, so there's ancestral memory, which I'm bringing in. And then there's also, it's like still a mashup of things. So names, proverbs. So I think it's Ife. In like the Yoruba tradition, you learn a bunch of proverbs, or there's things that they memorize if you're a practitioner of this. And then you use that when people come to you, and that's kind of divination through these things. So it's phrases that you get that you have to speak, but it's also memories that you're given by an ancestor. And it is this power. So I've combined several things, and it's sort of, there's a lot of rules to it. And hopefully it's clear as you know, when you come across it in the book. But yeah, so taking it from actual traditions, like Ife, and like the idea of just of naming it, and from African proverbs, every chapter opens with a proverb. And essentially, you're given this thing to speak, and speaking it into the world creates a reaction. Using your creative power, your energy, your che, which is what I call it in the book, which is just kind of the life energy or spirit energy, to manifest something. And yeah, so I write it out, I write down the rules, what it can do, what it can't do, what the costs are, what the benefits, who the practitioners are, why is it a limited resource. And in this story, it's very limited, only very few people in our world have access to this. And yeah, lots of spreadsheets. There's also other software involved too that helps you organize things. Because I need to have it laid out, and I need to understand it. And when I want it to do something that it can't do, I have to go back and rework it so that it can do that thing, or maybe not have it do that thing. So try not to have these holes where either everything can be solved by the magic, which isn't from a writerly perspective. You don't want to just be able to have a character wave their hand and solve everything with magic. There's no tension there. So it helps for it to have rules and have limitations that can actually cause problems for the characters. They wish they could do this with the magic, but they just can't. And that makes it more interesting to have magic that can't just solve every problem all the time.
And what does magic give the history? So, I mean, because this is a sort of blending of genres, right? So what can your books do that mine can't?
I think that, there's definitely, obviously, a place for very realistic stories that steep us in that. For me, having the magic gives you a way to imagine a way out, to imagine a solution that maybe we can't access yet. But in escapism, I'm reading fantasy because I want to escape from our world. So I bring you through sort of the dregs of some of the difficult parts of our world, and then say, if magic was real, how would we have used it to get free? And also, but not have that be in a negative way, like, okay, well, magic's not real, that obviously we can't do anything about it, but have it give you some sort of hope, because there's different layers of magic. There's everyday magic that we feel that might not be mystical, and there's no actual, the things that we do when we write fantasy that don't happen. But love is a kind of magic, and community is its own kind of magic. So there's parallels and metaphors of that, where taking it to that next level, where you actually have something mystical happening, is not only connecting it to cultures. Like every culture has had stories of myths, legends, gods, goddesses, magical things that happen that people believe in to a certain extent. And even if you don't believe in literal magic, you believe in, like your children's smiles and laughter and things that are magical, but that are still part of our world and they're still realistic. So it just bridges that gap between escapism and hope and the real life, everyday magic that we can create ourselves, I think.
I love that answer. I feel like I just want to sit and marinate on that for a minute. It gives us and one of the things, even just talking to you, I feel like you keep saying things like, what if? I just love the imagination of it, because I feel like so much that we really overcome has been through like the Black imagination.
Right, yeah. And I think having like stories of magic allows you to open your mind more to the real life solutions that you can create in our world. Like if you believe that it's possible, because manifesting and things like that, when you believe that something is possible, you can create it in real life. So opening your mind to the possibilities of something impossible can actually help you push the boundaries of what really is possible.
That's what Obama, like when Obama believed that he could be president, that was like a feat of imagination.
Magical thinking.
Yeah, it was a magical thing, because nobody believed it. Okay, let me ask you about like what tradition are you writing in? I'm sorry, I'm not like from the same genre, but I'm really curious because I feel like there are elements of Morrison here, but I also feel like there are elements of Tanana Reeve Dew, Octavia Butler, and I'm just curious, how you view yourself, because I feel like so much is going on right now in fiction that's so exciting for Black writers. And we talk about imagination, the fact that readers have the imagination to know that, like, we can write all kinds of things, y'all. You know, we don't have to just write literary realism. There's even, you know, to me, like burgeoning Black romance, which I think, I mean, we've always had some romance, but not as much as, you know, to me, we have now. I'm curious about, like, what authors influence you? How do you view yourself in the landscape of writers?
Yeah, it's hard because the authors you mentioned are huge influences. Octavia Butler, Tana Reid too has always been a huge influence, and I think that Gloria Naylor. You know, I went back to reread Mama Day before I wrote my previous book, Monsters We Defy, because moving into like historical fantasy, that was my first historical fantasy. So these are these two books. I wrote epic fantasy before and just straight romance. And so looking back at those things that were more grounded and like a little bit more literary tradition. I don't consider myself a literary writer because I'm doing fantasy and I want to have a romance in there, a strong love story in there. But there's that history of Black women writers and all the women who I read growing up, like Tina McKenna, Awenasa, and people who were writing about things that were speculative but weren't on the speculative shelf. You know, and Mama Day isn't considered fantasy, but it's definitely fantastical in a certain way. There's that element of Black culture and history that even Toni Morrison was writing about that isn't fantasy per se, but it's in the speculative. It is speculative. So yeah, it comes through my reading and living through those authors, Mal Hopkinson, people like that who I just read and loved and would love to be in conversation with and would love to have the books, you know, be in that world as well.
And you know, I feel like in the tradition of Black literature, we've never really fit in those like even the literary category. Like when you look back at like the Harlem Renaissance, I mean, if you're reading like Claude McKay, that wasn't necessarily literary fiction. I mean, it was social uplift fiction, and so we've always, I feel like, charted our own path. I mean, even jazz, which now is considered like high art, originally was considered quite raunchy. So. You know, I love how we're creating these spaces that the publishing world doesn't know what to do with. You know, it's like, yeah, I'm all of those things. You know, tell me about, you know, how you're publishing. So you've got all of these books that you've done in 9 years. So what has your publishing like story been like? I'm going to ask this question. I'm open up to the audience. I don't want to take it all. I just want to talk to Leslie all night, but. Like, what has the publishing journey been like for you in terms of uncharted territory? Because I know you were with independent publishers, now you're with big New York publisher. So, like, how has that path been in terms of having to, like, knock down doors?
So I started self-published completely. I self-published my first books because I had talked to other authors and who had horrible experiences. My first novel, Song of Blood and Stone, is an epic fantasy full of Black and brown people. It's a fantasy romance. I first published it in 2015, in January 2015. And so I was contacted by an editor at St. Martin's Press a year later. I had 2 books on the market. In that series, I had 4 books total on the market. I published 4 books in 1 year because that was great. And then I didn't publish again for 3 years because I didn't burn out. But so Song of Blood and Stone was republished. And this was in 2018 that came out for the first time with St. Martin's Press. It was before, like now, if you've heard the term romantasy, which is a big deal. Fantasy and romance combined is a thing that is a big seller, but in 2018 it was not. And so that was what I wanted my books to be. They were marketed as pure fantasy because there wasn't a fantasy romance or a romantasy shelf. And I did get a 4-book deal with St. Martin's Press, and all 4 books came out, but it was difficult for them to be the way I envisioned them. Because when you self-publish, you can chart your own path in a much easier way. When you're with one of the big 5, it has to fit in these boxes. And it was a little bit too much romance for fantasy readers, and maybe a little bit too much fantasy for romance readers at the time. And so, but you know, I was fortunate enough to have gotten that deal, to have gotten in the door of the publisher. And then my next contract was with Orbit, was with The Monsters We Defy, which was my first historical fantasy. And that one was a little bit of an easier sell because it was more, I mean, historical fantasy was still new, but there were people like P. Deli Clark who had done, I guess Ringshot had come out before, and the Black God's Drums, who was in that world of alternate history but fantasy, and there were other writers, other Black writers specifically, who started to be in that world. So it felt like it was a little bit easier of a sell for them to understand what to do with it. It's more fantasy. And yeah, the issue with publishing is it has to go on a shelf in a bookstore. You have to know exactly where to place it. And when you're crossing genres, that's always a bit of a difficult sell. So now I wonder if I come out now with my epic fantasy romance, it'd be a different story. But you still don't see, Black people on the cover has always been very important to me, like seeing ourselves on the cover. I have fought for covers, I fought for people to be the right skin color on the cover several times. And so, although romantasy and fantasy romance is a much bigger deal now thanks to certain authors and TikTok especially, it's still a little bit of a harder sell for Black and brown people because people don't feel like they can see themselves in books with people who don't look like them on the cover. When we have always been able to read books with people who don't look like us on the cover, and we don't have a problem with it. So yeah.
This is a beautiful cover. I love this. And one of the things that's kind of neat about it is like the shadow looks like it could be something else.
Well, if you actually look, it's a reflection, but there's a city. It's very faint. There's I wanted the city underwater to be on the front cover, and you have to look very carefully to find there's spires here. So this is her reflection, but also in the background there's these spires and these cities. And it's very subtle, but I asked for that and actually put it on there. So I love that you have to look a little deeper to find it.
I wonder if people know how much we have to fight for our covers.
Yeah, so with traditional publishing, I've had the experience where when I first went with my first books, they took my self-published cover as the first cover because I hired a very good designer. But then in the paperback, it was we're changing the covers to paperback. This is the cover. And I was like, that doesn't actually make any sense. But that's fine. It's just going to sell the book. So I didn't have any input. With the Monsters 3 to 5, it was with a different publisher, and I had made some suggestions that they didn't take. They did take when Barnes & Noble made the same suggestion, and Barnes & Noble was like, oh, we're not going to sell this book unless you change the cover. Then they changed it. But they did make the character darker. I was doing colorism in that book, and the first version, she was too light. And I was like, this character is a dark-skinned Black woman. You have to make her darker. They are amenable to certain things, but I think they'll get paint on it. This cover, I actually had to have them change the whole entire thing because of similar reasons. The character did not represent who I was writing about. I was writing about African gods and goddesses and dark-skinned people in the Deep South in the 30s, and the cover had to reflect that. So they did make the changes, and it came out beautifully. But so you can either have no input, but if you want input, you have to fight for it. And you have to be willing to potentially walk away. There have to be things where you have to know where your line is with publishers. And so I choose my battles. I didn't, title wasn't my title, but that I had chosen the battle for the cover. So
I always think, when I'm fighting those battles, I always think of younger writers who are first timers and they don't know what they can and can't fight for, and they're overwhelmed. Because I kind of know what I can and can't fight for, but if I were a debut novelist, I think I would just be okay. I would be so intimidated.
Yeah, and even with edits and things like that, you can fight for edits.
Yeah.
You don't have to take every edit that your editor gives you. Yeah. If you feel strongly about it, you really should stand up but know when to fight about it. You don't fight for everything, but figure out your lines in the sand. And that's important to know when you're going into, because these are corporations, and your editor, hopefully you have a good relationship with your editor and the people that you deal with, but it's not always their call. There are many, many layers of
there's sales, there's marketing.
Yes. Yeah, and they all have a say. And so know what your line in the sand is, what you are okay with, and what you're not okay with.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the crowd. If anybody has a question, I'm going to wait until you have the mic. Can you pass this one? Okay.
Hello, thank you so much for your work. The CDC released a report last month that drowning deaths are on the rise, with Black Americans having the second highest drowning death rate by race and ethnicity, and that coincides with high rates of Black swimming inability, a product of segregation. How do you see yourself responding to and intervening in that reality, whether that be creating empathy for drowning victims or rescue plans? I'm moved by your question, how do we save people who live underwater? What is your answer to your question, and how did you approach it?
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. As a person who has taken many swimming lessons and does not know how to swim, I have compassion. But yeah, there is a racial history to why so many Black people do not swim. And in this story, they live by the river, so that was an issue, and everybody knows how to swim. But drowning is a theme throughout. So the question of how do you save people who live underwater, that's sort of where the magic comes in for me. That aspect where we have the Orishas coming in, and part of the story is how they save people who are in communities that are underwater or who are drowned. And I think that in general, fiction creates empathy. There have been studies about that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to certain stories. I think that by telling the stories that I'm really passionate about, that come to me, and that are very specific, that I can create or be a part of creating empathy in the larger scheme of things. Like if you read a story about people who think care about these characters, that increases your capacity for empathy for everyone overall. And so, yeah, I hadn't thought about specifically drowning victims. That's very interesting to bring that to my attention. But in general, the story is about hope and is about finding hope in community and however that comes. And so, if there's something that I can do about helping people, I don't know about helping people learn to swim. I'd be happy because I do not swim. But I think it is important that we're saying I did not know that statistics that is actually very fascinating.
You clearly did a lot of research for this book, and I'm excited to read and see which parts of it made it in and whatnot. What are you currently researching for whatever is coming next for you?
Currently, I have a story that takes place in 1999. It's my Y2K story. So there's part research and part of just like mining my memories. Because I'm trying to do a character that is a similar age to me, so they would be in their early 20s in 1999. And yeah, remembering that kind of thing. There's another story, so I'm always working on more than one thing at a time. And that one, I'm not sure the time period yet, but I've been researching like the magic system. It's interesting that like this book, the one before it, and these two projects that I'm currently working on, they're very different, but they're coming from similar places. So I was dealing with ancestral memory a little bit in The Monsters We Defy, a lot here. The 1999 story deals with it in a different way. And there's certain themes that I'm coming back to over and over again and doing different research because they present themselves differently and they're going to be manifested differently, even though it's like a similar core idea. So things like ancestral memory and then a new magic system that's based on how there's a different way that I can do the same thing. How can I approach, a different story, a different magic system, but it's still very based in Black history, Black cultures, things from West Africa, things that are just in our stories that we tell and in our lives. And yeah, so a lot of, I have this research notes. I use a program called Notion to collect my research notes. And sometimes I transfer notes from book to book, so I have a different file per book. But I'm using the same, book or the same PDF file that I downloaded in someone's graduate thesis that I found on Ubuntu memory and ancestral memory. And it's just like a treasure trove, and then I look at the bibliography and find those things. So it's a lot of the same things, but yeah, it spreads out a little bit differently. And then it's always like world building things. Is there something in the economic system that I can do? There's something about colonialism that I'm going to deal with in a kind of a different way. And how is that going to manifest? And then looking for examples, like real places, real stories, trying to find, not necessarily biographies, but people's real experiences. I can create a character and find someone who's, some kind of primary resource, with someone that in history has talked about this thing. I can pull details and incorporate them into my characters. So yeah, my research is always all over the place.
Okay, this is very cool. You're very cool. Thank you for this. The fact that it's like, this is hitting all my boxes right now. That it's like paying attention to the Black history of this land and uplifting the Black history of this land, and paying attention to African tradition and weaving in like the fantasy elements and stuff like that. Like, just yes. Also, I just want to say, I love that I can like walk into Sankofa on a random Tuesday afternoon and just get all of this. I can receive all of this. So thank you for that too, Sankofa. So I have 2 questions. The first, y'all mentioned Toni Morrison earlier, and just listening. One question I have is, have you read Toni Morrison's book Paradise?
Paradise?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so how would you compare, because my reading of that book, I've only read it once, but to me that book is like a cautionary tale of bringing some aspects that we picked up from our colonizers into a Black autonomous situation. How would you compare the town of Paradise to the town that you created in your book?
So it's been a long time since I read it. I read it closer to when it came out, but I think I was doing something different. I was trying to create more like a Black utopia, like for real, maybe an idealized version. So there is still reality there, that threads in, but I wanted that contrast to be very clear. So we created this place that really is this haven that anybody would love to be there. It's got its problems too, and it's got, it's like people who, but maybe you're not gonna be friends with everybody, but you know everybody, and at the end of the day, you've got their back, even if you don't even like them. So I think that it was just a different motivation for the town that I was creating.
Thank you. And the second question I had is, so you said this title is not yours. What would you have titled this book?
So the title that I had from the very beginning was The God of Silent Tears. I wanted it to be from, and that's from the Native National Anthem. I think it's the 3rd stanza, God of our weary years, God of our silent tears. That was my title. They said it was too sad. And so I get that. It's not happy. So yeah, they went back to the drawing board in the title. But I just thought it was my first novel with them, The Monsters We Defy. That title came from a Claude McKay poem, and I wanted the title from a poem just to match that. It was that's kind of how my brain works. It felt very like simpatico, but I'm not unhappy with the title. It's just not the one that it was in my head the entire time I was writing it.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Hello. You had my question, but I would like to thank you for coming out with, well, all the guys that are coming out with fantasy books. I've been not to date myself, but I've been reading fantasy since like the late 70s. So it's nice to actually, be able to pick up a fantasy book by a Black author. And my question is, because I've read your fantasy books, and I've read them, what makes you veer off to write like the monsters we defy? I can never tell. I don't know how many people, but and I'm sure it's gonna be the same with that. But I know you have like a thought process, but they just seem to like come out of like, I'm here, I want you to write me.
Yeah, so as opposed to like epic fantasy like Ursula Chronicles, which I wrote Ursula Chronicles, which is my first series. It's 4 novels, 3 novellas. It's like 1 million words or something crazy. And I was tired, and I wanted to write a standalone. And so the Monsters We Defy, I was inspired by a tweet. I saw a tweet. There was some editor or agent who was looking for a Harlem Renaissance era fantasy heist. And I was like, I can write that. I've never read that. I want to write that. And that was really the genesis. And it didn't lend itself towards being a romance. I had seen myself as a romance writer because I had been embraced by the romance community. It was easier as a new writer because there was an RW chapter, Romance Writers of America. I live in Maryland. There was a Maryland Romance Writers chapter. So before I was published,